The Bible contains a large number of prayers told in a narrative context. In Nehemiah 9 we find one of them. Welcome to yet another tidbit from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm Dr. Paul Peterson, and today we are looking at one of the greatest and largest prayers in the books of the Bible. Interesting enough, the prayer in chapter 9 in Nehemiah may be compared to two other prayers that also are penitential prayers, and they're both found in chapters 9 of Daniel and Ezra, exilic and post-exilic books. So remember that, chapter 9 in these three chapters. There are differences. In the book of Daniel, the prayer in chapter 9 is an individual penitential prayer. Now, here in Nehemiah, the story is a public story. The people have celebrated the Feast of the Tabernacles. Now they are renewing the covenant with God. And that story is told in chapters 9 and 10. And really, those two should be read together, but for the sake of time, I will take a tidbit in one of the chapters at a time. They are now gathered on the 24th day in the month, as described in the first verse of the chapter. They have been fasting and praying, two spiritual disciplines that often go together in the Bible. And then they are asked by all the people, by some of the Levites, Jeshua, Kadmiel, Bani, and some other good names, in verse 5, to stand up and bless the Lord your God. And it said, from everlasting to everlasting. It is very likely that that last expression, from everlasting to everlasting, actually belongs to the following phrase, blessed be your glorious name from everlasting to everlasting. That is similar to the prayer in Daniel 2:20, where Daniel asks God's name to be blessed. Let's pause a moment with this blessing. What does that mean? Now, many people today would have some kind of magical sense of blessing as pushing a button and then something automatically happens. But here, blessing God, which actually is possible very often in the Old Testament, even though translators hesitate from using the phrase, blessing God means expressing gratitude. Blessing is here sharing the gifts. God gives a lot of gifts to us, and our response is gratitude. That's what we give him. So this is the content of the blessing in Old Testament prayers. Now, when you look at a prayer, it usually in the Bible would begin with an address, an invocation. You speak to God, you mention him directly, like in the most famous prayer of the Bible, Lord's Prayer, Our Father, who is in heaven. So that is an invocation that at the same time describes God. Next, you will move on to describe why you pray. You do that in different ways, and you will try to motivate God to answer your prayer, and you will of course bring, if it is a petition, your specific petitions. If we look at that, we will see that Nehemiah 9 and Daniel 9, for instance, differ on this particular point. In Daniel 9, the issue is the understanding of a previous prophecy about time, and Daniel's concern is therefore expressed in his specific petition in Daniel 9:19, do not delay. In Nehemiah's situation, or in the situation here in Nehemiah 9, you have the same kind of confession of sins, but the specific situation is different. The prayer closes with the phrase, we are in great distress. So this is another situation. Now, the description of God in the invocation is enlarged in chapter 9 if you read verse 6. You are the Lord, you alone. You have made heaven, the heavens of heavens, with all the hosts, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in it, and you preserve all of them. This description is a description of God as creator, with reference back to the fourth commandment, the Sabbath commandment in Exodus 20:11. It is interesting, by the way, that the same phrases quoting the fourth commandment are found in important texts in the New Testament, in the book of Acts. In Acts 4:24, after the release of Peter and John from prison, the praying community speaks to God, quoting this Sabbath commandment. And when Paul preaches for the first time to a Gentile audience in Lystra, in Acts 14:15, he also quotes this Sabbath commandment. It tells who God is. But as you move on, the description of God turns in the prayer in Nehemiah into a historical narrative. The rest of the prayer may be compared with some of the great historical psalms like 77, 78, 105, 106, and 107. Why? Because the motivation that the prayers here want to use to have God listen to their prayer and hear them out and answer is found in this history of the people. They describe the history of the people in such a way that they are able to confess their sins. This is the story of what God has done in history. What the people unfortunately have done in rebelled and sinned and apostated, and now they confess that. So the description of the history becomes a description also of what God has done and the opportunity to confess their sins. So this is a penitential prayer, but it uses a history. That is also the case in the book of Daniel in chapter 9, but here it is enlarged. Now, scholars speak about two ways of addressing God in praise: declarative or descriptive. Declarative, where you speak about what God is, and descriptive, where you speak about what God has done. Most of the prayer here describes what God has done, but there is one specific verse or two specific verses where the emphasis is what God is. Let's find them in the prayer. In verse 17, it speaks about history. They refuse to obey and so on, but then the prayers say, you are a God ready to forgive, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love, and you did not forsake them. This term is quite important. You did not forsake them, from the Hebrew azab. But the expressions, you are gracious and merciful, chanun and rahum, are expressions that are repeated a little later in the prayer in verse 31. Therefore, you gave them into the hands of the people of the lands. Nevertheless, in your great mercies, you did not make an end of them or forsake them. You have it here again. For you are a gracious and merciful God. Chanun and Rahum. So once again, the description of the declaration of what God is here emphasized. God is the creator, we see that from the beginning, and he is the God of forgiveness. Now, he is the Lord of history, and he is the creator of the whole world. And then they are bringing their supplications. That happens from verse 32. Now I'm using the English Standard Version, and you have some Bibles where the versification is slightly different, with only one verse. We will have to live with that. From verse 32 in the English Standard Version, you turn to supplications. And it's interesting that in the supplications, you have repeated one of the main expressions of verbs throughout the prayer. That is the Hebrew word nathan, to give. This is one of the themes of the prayer. In the beginning, you gave them, in verse 13, you gave them right rules and so on. You gave them laws. That is repeated. You gave them kingdoms in verse 22. And then in verse 27 it changes. You gave them into the hand of the enemies because of the sin. So you have a play on this term throughout. And in the end of the prayer, they say, they rule over our bodies, speaking about the foreign kings, and our livestock as they please. We are in great distress. And it has been said, our yield goes to kings whom you have set over us because of our sins. Set over us is actually from the same word, nathan. God gave. God is a great giver. Now they ask God to give them help to get out of their distress, and they want to promise to be obedient. Now let me finish with one observation. Much of Hebrew poetry is written in parallels. In verses 13 and 14 you have one example. It's said in the prayer to God, you came down from Mount Sinai and spoke with them from heaven. And then the second part of the verse, you gave them right rules and true laws, statutes and commandments. Then in the following line you have the parallel to the first one. You made known to them your holy Sabbath, and you commanded them commandments and statutes and the law by Moses your servant. In other words, you first have the description of what God said directly to the people from Sinai, then you have what he did through Moses. Then that's repeated with emphasis on the Sabbath, which was spoken directly from Sinai, and then the laws through Moses. So the Sabbath here reminds the people of God as a creator. And as we move on to the details of the covenant that they want to renew with God, we'll find that the Sabbath turns up again, as do other of the themes of the prayer and the previous history. Thank you for listening to the tidbits on this great prayer in the book of Nehemiah 9, and welcome back to another tidbit as we continue this renewal of the covenant at the time of Nehemiah when we look at chapter 10.